Good morning, everybody. Just doing a survey of who's here. Where's Lisa? Alabama? Don't what? Oh, my dad's side of the family is in Huntsville. Decatur? Is that better or worse than Huntsville? Well, Huntsville apparently is like blowing up and booming after COVID. Everybody wants to live out in Huntsville, but when I remember it, I had my uncle and aunt-in-law in Huntsville. Yeah. Aunt. You say aunt. If you say so. Is it pecan or pecan? Oh, that's the one? That's the line? Pecan? Okay. If you're fancy, pecan. Pecan?
But it's not pecan, it's pecan.
Anyway, my story was my uncle and my aunt, they had a stock car that they spent more money on than their house. And so they would go out to the Huntsville Speedway and do their little stock car racing. And then my uncle was out there racing, as he does, and turned into a derby where he was trying to attack the other cars. And he popped a tire, and they couldn't afford a spare tire, so he was out of the race. So,
Well, people from
Yeah.
Alabama are a little
Yeah.
better than all the rest.
they're better than everybody else? You say so. Okay, well, we're in Genesis 49 on that bombshell that Alabama is the greatest. Genesis 49. We're going to wrap this up today, I think, unless we get sidetracked, which, never happens in this class. So, let me just give you this info. At the conclusion of this particular series of talking about the life of Joseph, we're going to be taking a dive into the book of Revelation, finally. Now, George has been teaching Revelation the entirety of the book for the last, whatever it's been, 6 months, something like that. George 2, and then George 3 has filled the gap there when George 2 was in the hospital. He will be here today for worship, we're told. So that's great news. And so we're just diving in, talking about some controversy, which is always good in Revelation, talking about the intended purpose of the book, and then some context as an overview, and then diving into one particular question from the survey that y'all filled out. And then we're going to be moving towards the idea of the prison epistles. We finished with the book of Acts in the Loafers class on Wednesday nights, and we left Paul in prison. That's where he was at the end of the book of Acts. And then from that, we launch into a discussion about, he wrote Philippians while he was in house arrest or in prison in Rome. And he had a lot to say about that. So there's a lot of interesting things to talk about while he's imprisoned or under house arrest. He has a lot of good theological content. And so we'll go through that together in this class time. Again, the ladies are covering the women of the Bible in their Wednesday night women's class. And I just feel for some reason they're more qualified to talk about women than I am. I don't know. It's that whole open your mouth and put your foot right in it thing, or digging yourself into a hole. I'm great at that. But so that's the opportunities for you. We're trying to cover a lot of things that are giving you some variety. So that's the concept. My classes, though, they tend to be more text heavy because I think I have nothing original, nothing good to say outside of going to the scriptures and then opening them up together with you, reading them, meditating on them, discussing them. That's my bread and butter. That's what made me fall in love with the Word of God, and so I'm trying to impart some of that in my classes. So, okay. Having said all that, we are in Genesis 49, around something like verse 19. And what's happening here is Jacob, a.k.a. Israel, he's talking to in a prophetic way, an inspired way, we have to assume from the actual text that he is giving a revelation to his children and his grandchildren about what their families' lives will be like. Now, thankfully for us, we don't have to kind of think about what this means. We know what it means from the book of Exodus and Joshua especially. These families, these grandkids and kids of Jacob are going to become tribes. They're going to be very kind of clannish and unified in by their own name. So when they cross over the Jordan River in the book of Joshua to conquer the land of Canaan, they're going to be dividing up the land at the end of the book of Joshua into where they're going to settle and where they're going to stay and kind of keep the families together. And so these families being talked about here, this is a prophecy of what their lineage will kind of be like. Some of them are great. I mean, for example, verse 21 or verse 20, Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Good, right? Having the knowledge that your families are going to be doing well in the future. They're going to not have whiteness of teeth because of famine. You're going to be fed well. That's good. Naphtali, verse 21, is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. So they're going to be prosperous and have a large family. That's always good. There were some negative ones before, if you recall. The big one, I think, is the idea of from Judah, there's going to be a king in the future. So something significant about that. Then verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough, a fruitful bough by a spring, his branches run over the wall. So the middle clause there in verse 22, by a spring, is a constant biblical reference. The idea that you need to have water to have a thriving garden or vineyard. And so if you're planted by a stream, then you have that source of irrigation all year long. And so that's kind of the imagery here. Verse 23, the archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. Who is that? God. Yeah. It's true, but whenever you see that mighty one of Jacob, there's usually sometimes biblically a reference to maybe there's something a bit more going on here. It's kind of like when you see the angel of the Lord. The angel means messenger in Hebrew and in Greek, so it means messenger, but that singular clause there kind of alludes to something that we can't quite prove and pin down that we're talking about the second person of the Godhead, but it's something a bit deeper going on there, right? So the mighty one of Jacob, same idea, God, but you may read a little bit more into that, which is fine. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, or the rock of Israel. So you kind of get a little bit more here. God's talked about as being a shepherd before. He will be in the future in the book of Psalms, but there's also kind of, again, that hint, I am the good shepherd, someone said once. The corner. Yeah, the stone, the rock, the foundation, the bedrock, the cornerstone, all that's kind of like, there's this guy we know that kind of fits all those descriptions. How weird is that?
Yeah, they capitalized shepherd in my book.
What? Yeah, it's in the ESV as well. I mean, keep in mind there that the translation committees that put these translations together, they do that when they think we're talking about either Jesus or God most of the time, but the capitalization is not there in the Hebrew or in the Greek. But it's interesting. That should kind of perk your ears up or eyes up, whatever you use to read the Bible, to kind of say, there's something more here, right? Go ahead. Oh, definitely not in the Hebrew, but yeah,
It wasn't in the Hebrew.
Yeah, in the English, they would throw those capitalizations in there, and even the red letter, if you have a red letter Bible, they throw that in there to kind of give you some clues to, hey, there's some kind of connection here. So, for example, the mighty one of Jacob, we got Isaiah 1:24, where God's called that, Psalm 132:2, where he's called that the shepherd. This is The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Ever heard that line before? Yeah. I told you the story about what I thought that used to mean, right? I shall not want. I told you that, but you're different, Chris. So, well, I mean, it wasn't in an article in the Connect like 3 weeks ago, so I'm sure you all read that. It was the idea that I shall not want. When I first heard it, I didn't know what that meant because it's King James. So I'm like, well, what the psalmist means here, what David means is, well, I don't want the Lord as my shepherd, but he's going to be my shepherd whether I want it or not. I shall not want, meaning I don't want that shepherd. And then I read some other translation said, I shall be in lack of nothing. I'm like, oh, it's Shakespearean. I shall not want. I shall not be in want. I shall lack nothing. Oh, so that's, I've come a long way. Thank you. Been trying really hard. It's only been 18 years or whatever it's been. Okay, then the stone of Israel, all those connections are talking about the stone, the cornerstone, the rejected stone, all of that's kind of connected. So you have some help there if you're so interested. Anyway, verse 25, by the God of your Father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. So it looks like the two kids that come from Joseph are going to have a hard time, but they're going to be okay. That's kind of life, isn't it? You're going to have some hard times, but it's going to be okay because God's still there. The blessings of the deep that crouches beneath. Anyone want to guess what the deep is here? Remember the Hebrew worldview. Okay, so we're on the land, right? We're on land, correct? And then above you, what is up there? The heavens, right? So it looks like a great shield that goes all the way around from this side of the land to that side of the land. This big shield, and what must be up there? Well, yeah, but what else? Water, because it's blue. So what's blue? Water. So water is up there. And then there's like this big shield. Literally, this is a Hebrew word for shield as the heavens. And then you've got these stars that are kind of these lights that are dotted into that shield. And then we have these two big ones under the shield, right? That's the Hebrew worldview of the heavens. We've covered this in too much detail, right? And then you have the land that we're on, and then you have the deep. So you have two meanings of the deep. You have the waters where the ships go, and when the ships go under, they go to the deep. Then you have the other idea of the deep, which is Sheol, which is where you go when you die. So you go down there. You go under the earth. So if you've ever read the phrase, the creeping things that creep even under the earth, in the pit, in the depths, because they're down there. That's where they are. So that's a very simplistic worldview because there are primitive people that are hearing these things from God, and they kind of make sense of these things in their text the way it looks, which is very normal. So that's that. So blessings of the deep that crouches beneath. So even from down there, the Lord's blessing Jacob or Joseph. Verse 26, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. So you kind of have this idea that I'm giving you more than I received in my blessing, which, keep in mind here, this is Jacob we're talking about. So you know the story about Jacob and Esau, and Jacob fooling his father, Isaac, to give him the blessing. So he's saying, I'm giving you more than I took from my brother. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who is set apart from his brother. So he's set apart here literally because his brothers tried to kill him, sold him as a slave, all that. And then we end on this note. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, at evening dividing the spoil. So he's going to be cutthroat. Sorry, Benji. There you go. Doesn't look good for you. The only remark I have about that particular one is when I think about Benjamin, I can't help but think about King Saul. He's the first guy. He's the first king that they appointed or God appointed for them. He physically looked the part. He was head above everybody else, stature-wise. He was a handsome guy. He was humble at first, kind of just sorting out the baggage and the luggage when they went to assemble, and then he was called to be king, so that's a good sign. And then, of course, things did not end up well for him. If you don't know, you'll figure it out. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts? All right, let's zoom out a little bit, because this helps me refocus on what we're talking about, to kind of keep it in frame. We're zooming out here, away from this family. We've discovered so far that you've got this little family, this little clan in Canaan. And they're dwelling there because God said to their granddad, go to this place and I'll give it to you as an inheritance. And then fast forward a lot and you get to this clan out there and things are going okay. You have Jacob called Israel because he wrestled with an angel and he almost won. So God cheated and popped his hip out of socket, which will stop you from wrestling that day. Called him Prince of God because he was strong enough to try to fight the angel of the Lord of all people, because Jacob does that. And then you have that family kind of prosper. You have some sibling rivalry gone wrong in that dynamic. They sell one of their brothers as a slave to go to Egypt. And then he's there in Egypt, rises through the ranks, gets lied about, thrown in jail, rises through the ranks, interprets Pharaoh's dream. God gives him that dream to be able to, I guess, use Joseph in that situation to stop people losing their lives because of famine. So they lay by and store as they've been prospered for 7 years, and then they take out of the reserves for a rainy day fund, right? It's for 7 years. And through that whole exchange, the family that was out there in Canaan makes their way to Goshen, and there they live, and there they dwell, and they're being blessed in this fertile region for a while. And then before Jacob goes to be buried with his fathers, he gives all the children, all the tribes in the future, their prophecy about what they will be like, keeping in mind that they should not feel at home in this Egyptian place. They're being blessed there, they're being taken care of there, but that's not their home because God gave them another home. So you might be able to draw the lines between the dots I just painted. Here we are in a land, and we're being protected and being provided for in a fertile place, and God's watching over us and giving us blessings while we're here, sojourning and traveling, as Peter would call it later in his books. And then we shouldn't feel quite too at home because there's another place that God wants to give us back where we came from. So we were with God, and then we're away from God, and then we're going back to Him, right? So all the parallels are rich here in the book of Genesis. All right, here we go. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. If you didn't know, there you go. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each one with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Okay. So there's two ways to read that, right? What are the two options? We've covered this 1,000 times. All right, going to heaven, or you're literally having your bones placed on the other bones of your ancestors. You have the Pharisees who like that first reading a lot better, going to your gathered to your fathers in the spiritual place of heaven. The Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife, so they're like, well, of course it means just put your bones on the other bones that are there. That's where all the bones go is where the bones are, right? That's the other reading of it. So keep that in mind that even up until the first century, there was still debate about whether or not there's a spiritual reading or a physical reading. And then bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, and the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah, which we kind of glossed over because the text glosses over that and doesn't really mention it, which is, I think, a shame, but there it is. Verse 32, the field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. In case you were unclear that Ephron was a Hittite, he's a Hittite. Surprise. Verse 33, when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So I'm inclined to think that there's a different meaning beyond just put the bones where the bones are, because he was gathered to his people before he was buried in that cave. So, hint, hint. And also, if they ask Jesus, is there an afterlife? Yeah, for sure there is. Everlasting life is a promise of his, so I guess there is an afterlife. How about that? Okay, chapter 50. Any questions before we move on to the next so-called chapter? Again, this would be just one long, continuous run-on sentence in the Hebrew, and the Septuagint Greek version just keeps going. So we broke it up in the Middle Ages to be chapters and verses to be helpful, and it is. Okay, chapter 50, verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now, what do you think of when you see that?
It's a very foreign person.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a mummy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of what that is, but it's not quite the same age that we find our mummies at. They're kind of a later dynasty. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many were required for embalming. So they didn't know either when they were reading this. Those little clues are so nice to find. Like, for the reader, there's like a little footnote for them. Before footnotes were really a thing, they put it in the text, right? So when they were reading this, the person who read it likely wouldn't know, well, of course you need 40 days for embalming, because they didn't do embalming anymore when they're back in the land of Canaan. So when they were reading this, like, well, why was it 40 days? Because that's how long it took. Oh, thank you, right? Little clues in the text here tell us this is obviously written at a later date for people that were unfamiliar with this process. So those are kind of neat to find. And they're all the way throughout the scriptures. Okay. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Is that odd?
So it's kind of one of their head guys died.
Well, I would imagine that they would have had a lot of respect and appreciation for Joseph.
Right.
Because he was the dude that Pharaoh was like, you're going to be in charge of making sure we all don't die during a 7-year famine. And they didn't. So that's good. So they had a lot of respect for him. And when his father passes away, that would have been a pretty big deal. That patriarch died. They know that Joseph's kind of going through it emotionally, and they're appreciative to be able to show their sympathy in that kind of way. There's all kinds of wild, grief expressions throughout Scripture and even in our culture today. So culturally, we've got things that are normal to us that would have been foreign to them, and especially vice versa. So, do you know about hiring grievers? You've heard that before? Okay, so back in the first century especially, coming back from captivity up until the first century, it was common that you would hire someone, instead of having a funeral director, all your money would go towards a griever or a couple of grievers. So they would come to the services, if you will, and to the burial, and they would be paid to grieve openly and cry and fast and wear sackcloth and ashes to show their solemnity, their piety, I guess, to be a professional griever at a funeral. Does that seem a little odd to you? It's like hiring a theater person to show up at a funeral. It seems a bit weird, but that was culturally okay. That was normal for them. So here when you have 70 days as a time of grieving and weeping for someone that passed away, it's kind of like hearing an announcement on the local news. Well, this great person died, so everyone has to fast and has to cry for the next 30 days. Seems unusual, but if you say we're going to have a moment of silence to respect something insignificant to our country, for example, that's normal. It'd be normal. It'd be weird for them, and then vice versa. Okay?
I think it shows the fact that Jacob and Joseph
their respect for that group, because when his brothers first came to Egypt, the Egyptians would not even eat with an Israelite. And here they are weeping for him for 70 days. I think there shows a growth of respect there.
I hope so, right? If for nothing else, they're getting along better because they didn't have any respect in Egypt for people that were shepherds that took care of livestock. That wasn't their deal. I mean, because they have the Nile River to give them fertile, watered ground every year. They were farmers. They didn't care about cattle because they had farmland. That's where their food came from. And so to have these people that just took care of animals all day long, that was a whole different social thing for them. So to have that respect be passed for 70 days is significant. This would have come from Pharaoh, no doubt. Okay, verse 4. And when the days of weeping for him were past, everybody's feeling better now because the time of weeping are done. Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, let me please go up and bury my father, and then I will return." So let me go bury my father, and I'll be right back. Pharaoh answered, "Go up, bury your father as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brother, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. So talk about a procession, right? A funeral procession. This is all the important people in Egypt are leaving to go bury this guy. When they came to the threshing floor at Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, so if you know the Jordan River is past that, right? They lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. So 70 days of weeping in Egypt and 7 days of weeping here at the graveside. Why does the Bible keep using the same numbers? When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." And therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Let's see what the meaning of that is. The mourning of Egypt. Makes sense to me. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave at the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Here we go. One of my favorite passages in the entire story is this. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." Still weren't over it, were they? I mean, was it that bad? Trying to murder your own brother because you were jealous, but instead selling him as a slave. It wasn't that. No, they were still feeling it. This is decades later, and they're still thinking, all right.
I think this is a classic, like one of the classic examples of projection, because they just can't understand that he doesn't feel just like they did.
He said it at least twice. Like, hey, don't beat yourself up over this, to paraphrase. Because God sent me here before you to prepare this for the year of famine. And you're like, okay, all right.
He's considered that his purpose, and whatever it took to get him there, that's okay.
Yeah, which is the thing we should pull from that, right?
But they just can't
They can't. They can't. Oh.
But it makes sense in a human way.
Oh, absolutely.
Dad's going, he was just putting on a front for Dad. We're in trouble now. Makes sense.
Oh.
It's also the guilt of not forgiving yourself, maybe, because I think we all experience that. We know God has forgiven us of sin, but we'll still bring that sin up and think about it and say, oh God, I'm really sorry. And God's saying, what's that you talking about?
Yeah.
Forgive me.
Well, they were also worried about, if he didn't have the status that he had, they wouldn't be worried about it. He
So
knew a lot to him.
this morning we'll uncover a lot of that. This is the conclusion of the Peter, the most relatable apostle, where we previewed his prophecy of denial last week at the very end. Well, we're hitting the denial today. And then what happens afterwards. So the idea of being forgiven from God and then being able to forgive yourself is a struggle that we all have. And they had it. I mean, they're like, listen, Dad's gone. There ain't nothing stopping him from doing whatever he wants now. There's no way he's going to actually let us go with this. So they sent a message. I love that. They couldn't even go themselves. They sent a message. They sent a text to Joseph saying, hey, are you mad at me? No. Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. So now they're bringing God into this. Remember how we all serve the same God? You know how we're all related? We're all sad about Dad dying. Well, you know. But look at this. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. There's something about that kind of just gets me. Because here's Joseph. He's already grieving because Jacob's gone. Well, they have their own seed line now that's going to be blessed in Egypt while they're in that fertile land. And then the brothers are feeling this, and they send the message. And he's just like, really? You're still hung up on that? His brothers also came, fell down before him, and said, behold, we are your slaves. Now, in the English it says servants, but you know in the Hebrew it says slaves, right? Hebrew and Greek, whenever you see servant, it means slave. So they're literally saying, listen, we messed up. And we know you said you forgave us, but we really don't want you to forget that we are sorry about that. And to show you how sorry we are, listen, we are bowing down to you. Remember that dream when he was 17 years old? We're bowing down to you. We are your slaves. That's all we want to be. Joseph said, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? I mean, this dude, he got it. Every time we see him step up to the plate, he just knocks it for a home run every single time. He says, the things that you meant to be evil to me, God used for good. God sent me here to provide for you now. Your evil, he has made goodness. Am I in the place of God? No. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Verse 20, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So, verse 21, do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
I think we have to realize that
God did not make his brothers sell him into slavery, but God took what happened and used it for his purpose.
Oh, yeah. We don't see him, I mean, besides I'm not getting to the Pharaoh hardness heart thing, but we don't see him ever actually overriding anyone's free will, which is the entirety of the point. If he wanted people to have free will, a choice to make between good and evil, God's will and their own will, I mean, if we go back to Adam, that's what you see. If he made people to have free will, he's going to let them have free will. Now, whether or not their choices line up with God's intent of them having that free will is up for debate, because obviously people choose their own way over God's way consistently in Scripture and consistently in our lives. Yeah.
When Mordecai told her, you can be used to free your people. And if you don't, they're going to be saved, but you may be lost in the process.
Yeah. I mean, the Bible is full of people that are just like us. Every single one of them besides Jesus is just like us. I mean, they make mistakes. They sometimes do some good things. They have an impact on their communities, on their families, all that. And these are just people like us that God uses to bring about his will, because it's going to happen no matter what. I think it's interesting that when Jesus talks about the idea of prayer, of asking for the will of the Father to be done on earth just as it is in heaven. And then we see him in the garden praying 3 times for the cup of suffering to pass from him, but nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will, whatever God's will is. And then allowing himself to go through that suffering on the death of the cross. It tells us a whole lot about the idea of, yes, we have free will, and yes, God's will is going to ultimately be done through our good doings and our misgivings, but at the same time being open and subjugating ourselves to the will of the Father over our own will is the whole point of denying ourselves, right? So it's interesting that Joseph got that this early in the biblical story. Okay, questions, comments? Okay. So, Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw, we already see the cap kind of winnowing down, don't we? Right? Okay. So Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the sons of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you, key word there, and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Dad. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, key word, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Don't leave me here. Take me with you. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him. How long does it take? 40 days. Again, biblical number there. And he was put in a coffin, if you will, in Egypt. What a guy. Right? Yeah.
He was the younger brother.
Not the youngest, but he was a younger brother, yes.
Younger of all his older brothers. And it says here his brothers. He made the sons of Israel. Was that his actual brothers or their children? Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will visit you and you shall carry up my bones. Because I would have thought his older brothers would have died before him.
Yeah.
At least some of them.
I mean, the sons of Israel, at this point in time in history, we're not thinking literal sons of Israel, my biological brothers, anymore. Now we're transitioning between Israel just being a guy with a family to Israel now being a nation. So, yeah. All right, questions, comments? That's the life of Joseph. It's a wild ride. How about that timing? All right. Next week, we're going to be diving into everyone's favorite apocalyptic text, the book of Revelation. We're getting an overview of the context of what we find there, the entire point of the book, which is important to know before you read anything in that book, and then diving into some very controversial things that are happening. They've been happening for a long time. about so-called cashless society, the mark of the beast, etc. Covering that in one class, and then we'll be moving on to prison epistles. Okay? Prison epistles of the Apostle Paul. You got that right. Get in, get out. It's a summary, all right. All right. Thank you, folks.